Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Shivangi, and I would like to take you back with me into the early days of May 2021. It was the first 3 days of May 2021, not that long ago. Unfortunately, some of the worst days of my life. And I'll explain why. You see, both my parents were suffering seriously with COVID, the Delta variant. They were in a house that wasn't theirs, alone. They were in a city that they were visiting due to extenuating circumstances. They were in a country that they absolutely love, but hadn't been their home for decades, away from their adult children who would do anything to care for them, who were completely on two different continents on the other side of the world. So you see, my family at this time was in crisis. And during those 3 days, there was one question that just kept going over and over and over in my brain. And that question is, whom do I know? You see, we needed help. And so we needed to figure out quickly who would be able to care for my parents, even though there was the threat of COVID. They needed help. Who did we know that could arrange for oxygen in a city, Delhi, that seemed to be running out of it rapidly? Who did we know that could arrange for plasma or medicines, or even a doctor that we could reach out to ask for guidance? What should we be looking out for? How could we safeguard my parents during this time? Who did we know that could arrange for a hospital bed where it didn't matter how much money we seemed to be throwing at this problem, there didn't seem to be a decent hospital bed at a decent hospital anywhere in Delhi? Who did we know that could help me petition the Australian government in order to travel to India, because at that time the Australian borders were shut, both in and out of the country. In fact, if you were coming from India, there was a threat of really large fines as well as jail time. Who did we know that could help my brother get an emergency visa so that he could come from where he was coming from in order to travel and be with my parents during this time? So we were reaching out to any connection. We were racking our brains, reaching out to any connection that we had. And you can ask the question, you must be asking the question, did it work? Well, the answer is yes and no. My parents were never alone. You see, I had these beautiful cousins who literally risked their own health and their lives to take care of my parents as if they were their own, never leaving their side. And we had an army of people. I mean, it was people across, I think it was across 5 continents who were supporting in some way or the other, reaching out to people that they knew, connecting with old colleagues. I mean, literally just checking in on us, just doing anything they could to support. We had my parents never went without oxygen. They were some of the lucky ones. They never went without oxygen. They never went without medicines or plasma. Eventually, they did get those hospital beds at a very good hospital in Delhi. And my brother did make it over there. He was there for a night, about 15 hours before my father died. And he was with him that entire time. And minutes before my dad died, my brother held the phone to his ear so that I could speak to him, so he could hear my voice. And when my brother cremated my father and did the last rites, he was not alone. And for that, we were really grateful. And my mother, she recovered. She's doing really well, actually. And recently was in Australia. She was with my family. She met she was spent some time with my little ones. My littlest one, whom she met for the first time, a child that my father never got to meet in person. So why do I share this really difficult period with you? This story that every time I talk about it, it makes me cry. And I think the reason is because during this period of crisis, I learned a lot. The first thing that really struck me was the way people stepped up to support us. I mean, it was a thing to behold. How people reached out to other people, paid for oxygen from different countries, connected with others. We had someone connecting with an ex-colleague's junior staff member. I mean, it was extraordinary just how many people got involved and tried to do something to help. And I think it's because until this time, I have always thought of my friends and my colleagues as sort of companions in life. We're all just trying to have the human experience together. But during this time, the weight of these connections became crystal clear. And I try and think as to what was that quality that really spurred people on, sort of galvanized them into action. And the thing that rises above the rest is this quality of vulnerability. You see, I grew up in a family, and I guess I'm from a culture where we don't really talk a lot about the difficulties in our lives. We don't open up and share them with others, believing, I suspect, that to protect ourselves, we don't do that. And I was taught to be really independent in this challenging world, find the strength within. So having to ask for help was not something that I did very easily. I find asking for help really, really hard. And at this point, I didn't just have to ask for help. I had to beg for it. There was a vulnerability that was asked of us that really shocked me. I had to send my parents' medical details on text messages to people that I hadn't really been in touch with for a very long time, and they were forwarding it on. It was extraordinary how open we had to be about the experience that we were going through. And the truth is, if we weren't that open, we wouldn't have gotten the appropriate help that we needed. And the other quality that really was something that I saw very clearly, and on reflection I see it even more, is the quality of authenticity in the relationships that my parents had had. My parents, it comes to mind because there were so many of their friends who were trying to support us. People who had held me as a baby were, stepping up to do something. And these relationships had been built over periods of times, and there was such goodwill in them. It was something, truthfully, I'm so proud of my family for that. But when I look at these qualities of vulnerability and authenticity, I've seen them over and over and over again, not in myself, no, but I have been working in the nonprofit space for over a decade now. And most recently, I have been working with children that have dementia. And the number one response I get when we talk about children that have dementia is, we didn't know that children and young people could have dementia. Well, childhood dementia is very much a thing. There are about 700,000 children and young people that are currently living and suffering with dementia. And what that means is that these children and young people have a genetic disorder. That means they will lose their cognitive abilities, their physical abilities. They will regress slowly, sometimes over months, sometimes over years, sometimes over decades, until they die. Most children and young people with dementia don't expect to live past the age of 18. Some of those children will die in their infancy. And what I see with these families is that entire period, whether it's the decades or whether it's the months, that entire period is crisis. Now, I can't really speak, and I'm really reticent not to speak on behalf of families whose children have dementia, because truthfully, until it's your child or a child that you deeply love, you don't know what it is. You don't know what the experience is. But from an outsider's perspective, the only reason I can talk about the crises is because I see the fight. I see the fight that these families have to go through. I mean, they have to fight for diagnosis. Most people don't know childhood dementia is a thing, and so often the diagnosis is delayed. They have to fight for information. They reach out to families on the other side of the world in order to get appropriate information for their child. They have to fight in order to get onto medical trials. I mean, frankly, there's few, if any, therapies for childhood dementia. And so these children and young people are often fighting to get on some sort of medical trial that could possibly help them. These families are fighting in order to get appropriate support. I mean, even in countries like Australia, there are no systems that have been created with childhood dementia in mind. And so the care of these children, it's very often inequitable and inappropriate. And during this fight, you see these families and these children, they have to display, they're forced into a great amount of vulnerability. It's not by choice, it's just because they have to. They have to tell people over and over again what their experience is of childhood dementia. They have to explain to healthcare providers the daily experience that their child has and how their family home is set up. You know, if a family has to ask for help for financial support, for example, they have to explain the high care needs of their child is the reason why they have to stop work, but also why they have increased expenses, and therefore they're asking for help. And sometimes the vulnerability is forced upon them, as I've just described, but then there's that next layer of vulnerability that you also see. And that's when families, they're trying to make changes, not just for themselves and their child, but for other children who are experiencing what their child is going through, or other families that are experiencing what they are. So this is when I see families, you know, share their personal stories, sometimes of bereavement and what their experience was like when their child was alive, to try and explain to governments that they need to be investing in research and in the care of these children. Or I'll give you an example. I've seen a mother share the before experience of her daughter when she wasn't diagnosed and was fully healthy, to the after. She shared videos of how the speech had regressed and how her physical abilities had completely changed, in order for a philanthropist to simply understand, simply conceive of the experience that she is going through, watching her child suffer and die in front of her. And in this vulnerability, these families are trying to change the world for children with dementia. And in this vulnerability, I see great courage. Mind-blowing courage. Now, what I'm sharing with you is not new. We all know that vulnerability is a key quality of courage. We all know that connections really can change and impact our lives. But when I was asked to give this talk, and when I was told it was about rekindling connections, it took me about 5 seconds to think about what I wanted to speak about today. And I'll explain why. In my time of crisis, in my family's time of crisis, I was blown away by all these people, these connections. And when I mapped them out and tried to define who they were to me, I understood something that I'd never understood before. Is that these connections, these people, they make up my village. You see, I am a person who's lived in 5 different continents. I've been called a global nomad, or when I was in high school, people referred to me as a third culture kid. And when you are like that, you don't think of yourself as coming or belonging to a village, because you're never really there for a long enough period of time. And in my mind, a village was somewhere, in the old days, it was made up of hunters and gatherers, and they came together and they survived together. And that's what I realized was happening here, is these people were coming together to help us survive, literally a matter of life and death. And then it occurred to me that my village was so much more than what I had ever conceived of a village being. My village now, because of technology, exists because of WhatsApp messages sent in groups to groups of people. My village consists of DMs sent on Instagram because I saw beautiful photographs of someone's graduation or wedding or sadly of a difficult time in their life. My village consists of Zoom birthday calls where people get on from around the world just to wish someone in a time of pandemic and then we couldn't travel. My village consists of friends that I haven't spoken to since high school, or colleagues of colleagues that I remember going out to karaoke with. And this village, it has real power. Those relationships, the authenticity of those relationships, the depth of those relationships, what I understood in my crisis is that it has real power. So today I'd like to ask you to define your village. I understood what mine was only because I was living in crisis. Imagine what yours could be if you understand what it is from now. Think about your part in your village, because we all have a part to play in our village. We can help it thrive. When we grow, our village grows with us. And I'd like you to think about the reality that crisis is coming. We're living through a pandemic, a global pandemic. In Australia, we've just been through fires. Now we've been through floods. We've all been talking about recently how we're on the precipice of a third world war. And sometimes it's not even all of that. It's just the individual crisis in each family that we face. And when you are called to courage, when your crisis comes, it'll be the quality of the authenticity that you have displayed in your relationships, the depth of those relationships, the strength of your village that carries you through.